to the indie landfill, which I think it was last year when it got talked about a lot because of that Vice article. But we had, like I mentioned, we had Mark Bowman on who, almost blamed himself and the NME journalist at the time for not coming up with a better term for that scene, which kind of, he reckons, allowed that landfill tag to stick. Like, what do you make of it?
Do we know who came up with it? I suspect it was Andrew Harrison. Was it? I've got a funny feeling it was Andrew Harrison because it's his sort of thing. He was the guy, used to be my editor for a brief time on Mixmag. That's when I first met him. But he was the guy who came up with the term Britpop when he was editor of Select. I love Andrew dearly. He's just brilliant. I'm sure he came up with the term indie landfill. It was either him or Dorian Linsky. Anyway, the reason it's stuck is because it's right. And, so much of it is down to the way the record industry works, which is you've got a lot of record execs who are just looking for the easiest route to cash. And a lot of the time that means replicating what's already out there. And so you've got this kind of self-fulfilling situation where everybody was just signing anything that moved and, from a band point of view, and putting it out there and shoving some money behind it. So there was just this massive oversupply of, bands, some of which were interesting and some of which weren't. But the problem is it was also crowded out by that point that nobody had any space to breathe. Nobody ever made it to second albums. You look at the Horrors, who James Oldham signed to Luke over at Universal, who then got dropped after the first album, didn't do the numbers, and had to get picked up by XL afterwards to get a second album out. There was just so much of that stuff going on. So the notion of kind of churning through stuff really was driven by the kind of lack of imagination of the British record industry and the way it's set up. But we were kind of part of the problem because we had a scene and we had sort of scene blinkers on, and the stuff we do, there wasn't a lot of diversity to it towards the end, but that stuff is what worked really. I mean, it's always going to come to an end. That's part of the reason why I left, because I'm like, somebody needs to dream this all up again. And one, I don't think it's me. And secondly, I'm really not sure I've got the energy to do it again. It needed new blood. It was the right thing for the title, for the magazine, that somebody else took the reins. But you're right. The scene, I don't know. There was such a rush of stuff that it wasn't really appropriate to kind of stick a single name on it, like a kind of Steve Lamacq genre, Camden Lurch or something like that. It was, I mean, there was that other term, the New Rock Revolution, right, which was much more of a kind of an early Strokes, Stripes, kind of Datsuns, Von Bondi's thing. The Vines, Hives, all of those sort of bands that emerged 2002 to 2003, a little bit into 4. But that was actually, that was kind of coined not by us but by other people. It was a cover line. It was the Datsun's debut cover, because what had happened was the Strokes and the Stripes had arrived. They'd just tilted the world on its axis, and I had a mate of mine who was deputy editor of The Face at the time. We'd both been on Mixmag, and a guy called Tom Whitwell, went on to be digital director of the Times, of all things, and he was deputy editor on The Face. And he said as soon as the first pictures and track of the Strokes came into the office at The Face, he said the entire staff dropped dance music and everybody turned up in Converse the next day. He said it was literally like flicking a fucking switch. Everybody was so ready for something new, and suddenly here was rock and roll again. It was like, fuck yeah, and it's American. So that pendulum had swung from the UK dance scene right the way across the Atlantic, right? Which has just been happening since the 1950s. It was literally like rock and roll, turning up in 1954. And it was cool, it was distant, it was yank, it was hip. It looked different, it had echoes of the past, it was just everything that you wanted it. So there's massive demand for guitar music, and nobody's prepared. And this thing is running at the speed of the internet, which nobody had ever seen before, right? So that people are able to exchange stuff much more quickly than before. So it's running at an enormous pace. So you've suddenly got this gap. Record labels are suddenly going, fuck, we need some bands. We haven't got time to sign something. So who's on the books already? Who have we got who we can just plug the gaps? And none of the big UK labels had anything. But what they did have was associated labels in the rest of the English speaking world who did have bands. So basically they went out to the Commonwealth effectively. So you suddenly got, as well as the American bands that were being brought over, you got all these Australian and New Zealand bands that were suddenly mysteriously elevated and being given promotional budgets in the UK to kind of plug this guitar gap that had been created. And it was only when Franz Ferdinand turned up. They were the first proper UK band that responded to that post-Stroke Stripes world that had been signed, kind of developed a little bit, and kind of brought through. But in between, so kind of 2002 must have been, we did the Datsuns on the cover, and the cover line for the Datsuns that I wrote was, the Datsuns all hail the heroes of the new rock revolution, right? So there's a big thing happening, everyone's back into rock music, these guys are amazing, they've got these big tracks, stick them on the cover. And people started the context of it was that obviously Kerrang were big into new metal. So that word new had taken on this weird prefix connotation, where instead of reading it as the heroes of the new rock revolution, this headline was read as heroes of the new rock revolution, as if this was a genre that we had, so the Kerrang had new metal, we had the new rock revolution. And we started getting letters, bitchy ones, obviously, going, this is NME made up crap. You've just invented another genre, fucking music journalists, got nothing better to do. It's not real, man. This new rock revolution thing, it isn't a thing. And I'm like, it is now, because I didn't come up with it, you did, right? I didn't invent the new rock revolution by bitching about it. You've just framed it in a totally different way. So it started getting used as a term everywhere, to the point where I'm like, fuck it, let's run with it, right? So I then put out a new rock revolution cover mount CD with as many of the bands as we could get that were part of the scene, and that just kind of became a thing. So the new rock revolution was as close as we got to a term that encompassed the bands. But by the time you got to it was the K bands that changed everything. So the Killers, Kaiser Chief, Kasabian, and Kings of Leon, right? The K bands, when they turned up, they bridged our scene and mainstream radio. Right. So there were suddenly bands that could play on Radio 1 and potentially Radio 2. And that was the big shift. They could certainly dominate daytime radio. They could get onto local, local radio station playlists as well. So those K bands shifted the dynamic of everything. And suddenly it kind of went mainstream. And at that point, it was too big to put a label on it. And all of that stuff was not indie landfill. It was mainstream indie, in a kind of a Britpop sort of way. Indie landfill was the stuff that sat underneath that never made it above that chasm between being some kind of, a band that was playing, Nabucco, kind of 3 times a month, to a band that, or the Metro, or, Barfly or whatever, or Death Disco, and a band that could step up and actually start doing UK tours and do some numbers. So I don't mind the term at all. I think it's highly accurate. It was a thing, right? Too many bands, too many of them were shit.
But do you not think that happens with every big scene where you get
Yeah.
the first wave of bands, and then, you know, the people that are trying to live off the back of that kind of thing.
Yeah, same thing with Britpop, and it was the same thing, the same dynamic. It was slightly different in dance music because it was all track based, but happened in dance music to a certain extent in the late 90s. There was just too much crap. It's oversupply. Like I say, it's a dynamic that says as much about the way the record industry works as it does about the music press.
Yeah.